So, good morning. I want to talk this morning about stop clinging and start flowing. And this is another quote from Alan Watts, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we talked about laughter, who was, as you know, a student of Eastern philosophy, although including but not exclusively Buddhism. But I really like his teachings. And so I wanted to share another one of his teachings with you today. And in this quote, stop clinging and start flowing, he's comparing life to a river, which is also one of my favorite metaphors. And the idea is that rivers don't struggle to flow. They simply follow their nature, moving around obstacles, continuing downstream rather than fighting against them. So when Alan Watts suggests we stop clinging and start flowing, he invites us to observe how we might be unnecessarily resisting life's natural flow or life's natural movement. Just like a river that doesn't cling to its banks or fight its current, we too might find greater peace if we allow life to just unfold naturally on its own terms, something most of us struggle with doing. Another way to say this is that what we resist tightens and what we allow softens. So when we resist by gripping or clinging, that tightens, that constricts us, and what we allow to flow softens us. So what does it mean, though, to say that we cling or resist to life? We cling when we desperately hold on to situations or try to hold on to situations that are naturally changing because of this law of impermanence. We resist inevitable transitions. We resist inevitable transformations. We attempt to control outcomes beyond our influence, particularly the future. We hold tightly to fixed identities, to fixed self-concepts, all the stuff our ego asks of us. We become rigid in our thinking and perspectives. Our world shrinks. This clinging creates tension, both mental tension, physical tension, because we're expending all this energy fighting against reality rather than working with it, rather than flowing with it. Flowing, by contrast, is just a different way of engaging with life. So some of the characteristics of flowing are adaptability, for instance, like water conforming to whatever container holds it. If it's a big bucket, it adapts to it. If it's a tiny little test tube, it adapts to that. So adaptability is part of this flowing metaphor. And then there's responsiveness, moving with circumstances rather than against them. Like, again, the flow of the river. We're responsive to wherever the flow takes us. Present moment awareness, being fully engaged with what's happening now, and then non-attachment, allowing experiences to come and go without clinging to them or pushing them away if they're unpleasant. And then there's spontaneity, acting naturally rather than from rigid scripts, responding to the moment as the moment demands rather than imposing a script on it. And so those are some of the ways that we can flow. And there's a fascinating paradox, I think, in Watts's teaching. By surrendering our grip, by letting go of clinging, we often gain more genuine influence and effectiveness because, like water, we can carve canyons through our persistent, yielding flow rather than through force. We don't force it, we just kind of go through the canyons, we go wherever we need to go. When we stop exhausting ourselves with resistance and control, we have all this energy left over for meaningful action. We develop what the Taoists call effortless effort. Wu Wei is the term. This idea that we just sort of show up without having to expend a lot of effort. Action that arises naturally and appropriately from our circumstances and in response to our circumstances. So all that said, then, how do we apply this philosophy in our daily lives? So first of all is, of course, our old friend noticing. When we're tensing against reality, when we're locking down physically or mentally in the face of circumstances that we don't like, That asks us to practice accepting unchangeable circumstances, giving up trying to change unchangeable circumstances. We develop greater flexibility in our plans and our expectations. We don't lock on to single or more rigid expectations and plans. We cultivate awareness that there are natural rhythms in our lives. And we trust our innate capacity to respond appropriately without excessive control. I mean, control is something we all have to work with. It's often our default. And so at its core, Watts's river metaphor about stop clinging and start flowing really points to a profound truth, that we are not separate from the flowing process of existence. We are part of it. And if we position ourselves as separate from it, we're going to suffer and we're going to be incredibly frustrated. Our attempt to stand apart, separate from life's currents and control it as an outside force creates suffering. That it's just not going to work. When we recognize ourselves as expressions of this same flowing reality, not isolated entities fighting against it, this opens us up to participating more fully in life's and more joyfully in life's natural unfolding. Life, like a river, has its own natural intelligence. By aligning with its flow and not battling against it, we may discover that we've been swimming upstream unnecessarily. We can begin to see the ways in which we're resisting that reality. When the current itself knows exactly where to go, if we only give into it. So in the Buddhist tradition, the metaphor of a river is both profound and practical because it mirrors the transient and ever-changing nature of life. So Alan Watts' quote, "Life is like a river, so stop clinging and start flowing," really resonates deeply with this path. And as I said earlier, particularly with the concept of impermanence and also non-attachment and the path to inner peace. His statement encourages us to let go of our resistance to the natural flow of life. And in doing so, we cultivate a deeper harmony with its unfolding. If we just step back and watch it, we can see the flow. We can see how it's unfolding in front of us. But when we hunker down and try to control it or resist it, that's where the suffering comes in. Buddhism teaches us that life is inherently dynamic and impermanent, and we have to accept that reality or suffer if we fail to. Everything we experience, our thoughts, our emotions, our relationships, even our physical existence, is constantly in flux, something we talk about here all the time. And the Buddha himself compared the human experience to a river, emphasizing that nothing remains fixed or static. Just as a river flows, changing its course, changing its depth, changing its speed, depending on the conditions, so do the circumstances of our lives continuously shift. And if we're mindful and noticing, we can adapt to the changes in course, in depth, and speed. But again, as humans, our tendency is to resist this flow. We want the control. We want to be in charge of it, but we're not. We cling to what we desire, we avoid what we fear, and we struggle mightily against the current of change. This attachment and aversion, two of the three poisons you'll recall, are the root causes of suffering. Remember, greed or attachment, hatred or aversion, and delusion being the third, are two of the three poisons. When Watts advises us to stop clinging, he is pointing directly at this tendency to hold on tightly to things as they are, which by their very nature are impermanent. By clinging, we attempt to freeze the river. We attempt to hold onto the water, to make it conform to our desires, which only leads to greater frustration and suffering. The act of flowing in Watt's metaphor aligns closely with the Buddhist principle of letting go or non-attachment. It means accepting the reality of change, constant change, and moving with it rather than resisting it. For example, when we face a difficult decision in our lives, our instinct might be to fight against it, wish it were different, cling to what we wish it was, on and on and on, rather than watching it unfold and making the most skillful decisions we can, given the impermanence of it. If we resist it, it only deepens our suffering and probably ends up with an outcome we don't want in the end. Instead, if we can acknowledge the situation as it is, without judgment, without resistance, then we navigate it more skillfully. Just as a swimmer flows with the current rather than against it. If you've ever been in a river on a raft and just flowing down the river, and then you try to turn it around and go upstream, it's not going to happen. Those of us that have ever done tubing know this all too well. Letting go means releasing our attachment to fixed identities or fixed outcomes, something we talk about here practically every week. We often define ourselves by these rigid categories, these rigid labels, our careers, our relationships, our degrees, our possessions, and we grip tightly to these identities as if A, they were important, and B, they were the essence of who we are. But not only are they not the essence of who we are, they're subject to change. We can lose our job, we can have a lifestyle change, whatever. Everything is subject to change, and when we loosen this grip, we open ourselves to the freedom and the creativity that comes from living in alignment with the natural flow of life. So, practically speaking, how do we embrace Watts' wisdom? How do we bring flowing into our daily lives? Well, of course, we always start with our mindfulness, being present in the moment without clinging to the past or grasping and trying to control the future, both of which are a fool's errand. When we are mindful, we become more attuned to the rhythms of life. When we pay attention, we can watch it unfold because that's where we're putting our attention. We notice the subtle way in which things arise and pass away all the time. And this awareness, just this awareness alone, helps us respond to situations with greater ease and flexibility, rather than clinging to what we think should happen. The should happen is where we get into trouble. And then, of course, we want to develop equanimity, which is a balanced and accepting state of mind of how things are in the moment. When challenges arise, rather than reacting with anger, with fear or frustration, we pause. We remind ourselves that this too is part of the river's flow. When we approach life with equanimity, we learn to ride the waves of joy and sorrow without being swept away by them. We embrace impermanence, which inspires us to cherish the present moment. When we stop clinging and start flowing, we come to see that every moment, whether it's joyful, whether it's boring, whether it's mundane, whether it's challenging, is always fleeting. It's never static. And this perspective encourages us to live with greater gratitude and greater presence, appreciating the beauty and the awe of life as it unfolds. Just step back and watch it. The wisdom of flowing lies in its ability to free us from unnecessary suffering. When we stop clinging, we release the tension and the anxiety that comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. Think about how much energy we expend trying to control the uncontrollable. We begin to trust in the natural flow of life, recognizing that just as a river finds its way to the ocean, so too will our lives unfold according to their own rhythm and their own logic. In Buddhism, this sense of trust is rooted in our understanding of interdependence. Just as a river is shaped by countless conditions, rain, gravity, terrain, that it flows through. Our lives are shaped by this intricate web of causes and conditions. By flowing, when we flow with this interconnected reality, we align ourselves with the deeper wisdom of existence. Watts' quote, "Life is like a river, stop clinging and start flowing," reminds us of a fundamental truth that resonates with our Buddhist teaching. Life is impermanent, it is ever-changing, and most importantly, it is beyond our ultimate control, as much as we don't like that and don't want to believe that. When we release our attachment to things which are ultimately transient, and when we embrace the flow of life with mindfulness, equanimity, and trust, there is a profound sense of peace and freedom in that. That's the freedom and peace the Buddha promised. We're not fighting the current. We learn to swim with it. We allow the river to carry us forward toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the nature of reality. And in doing this, this allows us to embody the essence of the Dharma and experience the joy of living, of truly living in the moment. So those are some thoughts today on stop clinging and start flowing.